They found the bones first, small ones, pale as candle wax, pressed into clay behind a cabin that had already begun to rot while it still stood. The dirt smelled wrong when it was turned, sweet and ironed, like something that had learned how to wait. Men who had worked fields all their lives stepped back from the hole because the ground itself seemed to breathe. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a scream unraveled, thin and human, then cut clean, as if a hand had learned exactly where to press. Fire would come later. Fire always comes later. But in that moment, there was only the earth opening its mouth and telling a truth no one had wanted to hear. The Ozarks have always been good at this, keeping secrets until they decide to surface them whole. If you're listening to this now, pause just long enough to notice where you are. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The answer doesn't matter to the story, but it matters to you, because distance is part of how these things survive. Distance and time, and the belief that what happens in the hollows stays there. In the late years of the 19th century, the Missouri Ozarks were less a place than a condition. Ridges folded over one another like knuckles. Hollows swallowed sound. Smoke rose straight up from cabins and vanished before it could point a finger. Maps showed names, but the land obeyed older rules. Here, isolation wasn't loneliness. It was authority. A man could shape a world with nothing but timber, scripture, and the certainty that no one would come looking. Silas Farnham understood this when he brought his daughters into a cut of land so narrow the sun had to ask permission to reach the floor. He said he was answering a calling. He said the noise of towns interfered with obedience. The neighbors accepted this because the mountains had trained them to accept almost anything that arrived quietly. A widowed preacher with 3 girls and a Bible didn't look like a threat. He looked like grief looking for space. The cabin he built sat low and watchful. The door faced inward, toward the hollow, not outward, toward the trail. Iron found its way into places wood should have been enough. Locks where there was no need for locks. Bolts fitted on the outside of interior doors, details easy to miss unless you knew how to look for cages disguised as rooms. The daughters were seen at first. Delilah with her eyes always lowered, as if the ground might open. Prudence smiling too quickly, then not at all. Temperance staring past people, memorizing sky and leaf and cloud, storing away things she might need later. Then they stopped coming down the trail. Explanations arrived ahead of questions. Illness, work, preparation, words laid gently over absence until absence felt earned. What no one said out loud was that the silence had changed shape. It pressed closer. It learned edges. By the time the first rumor surfaced, bruises like fingerprints, screams folded into night. The hollow had already closed around the cabin like a fist, and inside that fist, something ancient and patient was being taught a new language, one made of obedience, blood, and the dangerous idea that God does not need witnesses. In the Ozarks, rumors don't travel fast. They sink. They seep into wells and wait for someone thirsty enough to draw them back up. The first of these came carried by a woman's hands. Mrs. Gable walked the 3 miles to the Farnham place, with a jar of preserves and a reason she rehearsed along the way: trade for herbs, neighborly courtesy. She told herself this as the trees closed behind her and the light thinned to a gray that felt intentional. Delilah met her near the wash line, bucket heavy, wrists marked with rings that weren't jewelry. The girl didn't look up. She didn't need to. Silence had already been taught where to stand. Silas Farnham stepped out as if summoned by thought alone. He explained the bruises before Mrs. Gable could shape the question. A fall, clumsiness, youth. His hand rested on his daughter's shoulder, with a weight that bent posture into apology. Mrs. Gable carried her jar home, untouched, and learned the first rule of the hollow. When a man answers too quickly, he's not talking to you. He's talking to whatever he's afraid you'll see. Spring came late that year, and with it prudence, thin as if winter had learned her outline by heart. At Harris's store she flinched at the scrape of a chair, the sound echoing too long in her head. Silas hovered, correcting her posture, finishing her sentences, paying before anyone could linger on the way fear fits a face. He said fever, a wasting one, the kind that steals appetite and leaves nothing visible for the law to hold. Harris watched them leave and told his wife he'd seen something wrong without knowing how to name it. Hunters heard the scream in summer. It slid through timber after dark, not animal, not close, stretched thin by distance and pleading. Men stop because stopping is instinct. They moved on because property and night make cowards of sense. By morning the scream had become a story that refused to grow into a question. Silas baptized it in explanation. Nerves, female weakness, inherited hysteria, words chosen to sound medical, merciful, and final. Later, a peddler mentioned a glimpse through a curtain, a belly unmistakable in its shape and timing. The midwife waited for a knock that never came. Months passed. Silas said God had taken the child before breath. No grave marked it. No paper recorded it. When the same rumor rose again the following spring, people learned a second rule. Twice is coincidence if you refuse to count. If you're still listening, take another breath and notice the room you're in. Which city are you hearing this from? And what time is it right now? The mountains count time differently. They measure it in what goes unchallenged. Sheriff Amos Pritchard counted other things. Dates, names, patterns that pretended to be nothing. He wrote down bruises described, screams heard, fevers that weren't fevers, births that left no marks. He rode past the gap and noticed smoke that didn't work hard enough for 4 people. A door with an inside life and an outside lock. He knocked once without authority and left with a jaw set tighter than before. The hollow watched him go and learned his shape. Silence by then had become deliberate, a door closing softly but firmly, and behind it, prayers were being spoken aloud so the house could hear them, words bent into tools, obedience hammered into something that would hold. By late summer, the gap had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Trails softened under heat and rain until they looked like animal paths. The cabin withdrew into itself, smoke rising straight and thin, as if even fire had been taught restraint. Delilah no longer carried water where she could be seen. Prudence vanished entirely. Temperance sometimes watched the sky through a split in the wall, counting hours by the angle of light, memorizing the world she might need to reconstruct later from memory alone. Silas Farnham prayed loudly. He prayed so the walls would hear him. Covenant, purity, obedience. Words delivered with the certainty of a man who believed silence was agreement. He spoke of the outside world as contamination, temptation shaped like a door. Inside the hollow, faith stopped being belief and became architecture. Iron and wood learned theology. Locks were no longer restraints. They were proof. People asked, later, why no one went up sooner. The answer lived in the habits of the place, distance, pride. The rule that a man's home was a law unto itself. The Ozarks raised generations on the idea that survival depended on minding your own business. Most of the time it did. This was one of the times it didn't. Sheriff Pritchard waited, because waiting was the only thing that didn't start a feud or end a career. He waited for something that could stand in a courtroom. Rumor hardens slowly, but fact arrives all at once. When it did, it came on wheels. Josiah Crane, the peddler, was 35 and reliable as sunrise. His rote was written in an account book his wife could recite from memory when he didn't come home. Ruth Crane didn't wait for gossip to decide his fate. She carried the ledger straight to the sheriff's desk and laid it down like an accusation. Pritchard read the neat hand, the dates, the distances. A man that predictable does not vanish without help. The trail led where it always had. One kitchen at a time, one door shut behind him at a time, until it arrowed toward the mountains and stopped making sense. Neighbors had seen the wagon turn up the narrow path toward Farnham's place. No one had seen it come back down. The last confirmed stop and the wrong destination were the same. Pritchard rode up with courtesy and caution, the way you approach something coiled. Silas met him with practiced ease. No, he hadn't seen Crane. The Lord's paths were mysterious. As they spoke, the sheriff's eyes caught on an interior door fitted with an iron bolt set on the outside. He asked nothing. He left with the shape of a warrant forming in his mind. Search parties followed. Men spread along ravines that tried to fold them in half. The county gave up its first piece on the third day, Crane's wagon. Neat in its emptiness, stripped down to boards. Commerce without a body. Proof of place, not of death. Enough to keep the case alive, not enough to break a door. Autumn crept in, and with it the sense that something was timing itself. The hollow held its breath. Somewhere behind a locked door, a girl learned to keep her own breath small. Somewhere in town, a sheriff closed his notebook and waited for the hinge that would finally swing. The weeks that followed settled into a kind of suspended decay. Not quiet, not movement. Something in between. Like meat kept just cold enough to hide its smell. Women spoke in kitchens with curtains drawn, counting months in their heads and setting cups down too hard when the numbers aligned. Twice was no longer coincidence. Twice was a pattern, and patterns, once noticed, begin to stare back. Hunters brought back small stories they didn't want to own. Shapes nailed to trees that looked like symbols until you stared too long and saw they were prayers turned sideways. Dead animals laid out with care, not torn, not eaten, their bones arranged as if someone were learning anatomy from scripture. A child's hand had done some of it. That much was clear. Too small to be random, too deliberate to be play. At night, the screaming returned. Not every night. That would have drawn a line too bright to ignore. It came irregular, threaded between hours, sometimes breaking off mid. Note, as if a mouth had been covered by something that knew exactly how much pressure to use. Men heard it from their beds and lay still, listening to their wives breathing, telling themselves it was fox or owl or wind, folding through a gap that liked to talk back. Inside the cabin, the girls learned different lessons. Delilah learned how pain could hollow a person until the body remained, but the self stepped aside. Prudence learned to please, to smile at commands until they felt like choices. Temperance learned to watch, to remember, to count steps between rooms, seconds between prayers, the sound of a latch settling home. She learned which boards complained and which stayed quiet. She learned how obedience could be performed without being given. Silas called it instruction. He said the girls were being raised apart from corruption. He said the blood must remain clean, untested by the world. At night, he read from a book he had made by cutting and stitching other books together. Verses bent into a shape that answered only to him. Rituals followed. kneeling until joints burned, fasting until hunger sang. Confessions demanded for sins that had to be invented so they could be punished. The body taught what the mind resisted. Sometimes there were visitors, not welcomed, not announced. Men who strayed from trails, peddlers who argued. Voices that rose where silence was required. Those encounters ended quickly. The hollow was good at swallowing sound, and the ground was already learning names. If you're still here, ask yourself again, quietly, which city are you listening from, and what time it is right now? Somewhere else. At some other hour, a door is being bolted for reasons that will sound holy if no one interrupts. Sheriff Pritchard felt the pressure building. He mapped approaches, counted steps, noted how the ground forced a man to turn his back to latch a gate. He wasn't planning a raid. He was thinking like the terrain, waiting for proof to step into the open. It arrived wearing plain clothes and riding a tired horse. A missionary woman on her yearly circuit, carrying scripture and conversation where newspapers never reached. Her name was Abigail Morse. And the day she turned toward the gap, the hollow finally misjudged how much silence it could hold. Sister Abigail Morse rode into the hollow with the patience of someone who had learned not to rush fear. Her horse picked its way along the narrowing trail, hooves dull against damp earth. The cabin appeared without ceremony. Timber crouched low, smoke lifting straight as if pinned. Silas Farnham met her on the porch, with courtesy polished by repetition. He spoke of isolation as virtue, of keeping the world at bay. Abigail listened the way circuit riders learn to listen, eyes noting what words try to hide. The tidiness, the absence of clutter that comes with children, the way silence pressed from the corners instead of resting. When Silas stepped away to fetch water, the house exhaled. An interior door eased open just enough to admit a shadow. Temperance slipped through, narrow as a held breath. Her hand caught Abigail's sleeve with a grip that left half moons in the fabric. The girl spoke fast and low, words tearing themselves loose. Locked rooms. Bolts turned from the outside. Prayers that were not prayers. A father who came at night with scripture in his mouth and commandments in his hands. She said the word covenant like it tasted wrong. She said the word union and did not understand why Abigail's face changed. She spoke of blood kept, pure, of a line folded back on itself until father and husband were the same man, of children conceived in darkness and called holy, of births that never reached daylight, of small bodies wrapped and given to the ground behind the cabin, while hymns were whispered to make it right. A peddler who had seen too much and argued. A sound like wood on stone. Silence after. Boots crossed the porch. Silas returned with a bucket and a smile. Abigail drank, prayed politely, and stored every detail the way some people store matches. When she left, she did not stop in town for rest or comfort. She went straight to the sheriff. Amos Pritchard listened without interruption. The room cooled as names and acts aligned into a shape the law could finally recognize. This was not rumor. It was testimony. Incest named plainly. Imprisonment described precisely. Murder implied by place and pattern. He swore her statement and locked it away, with the others that had been waiting for a key. Quiet riders followed. Men who had heard screams. A woman who had seen bruises. Each account tightened the frame. The judge read the stack and understood the weight. It would bring down on the county. The warrant dried with the seal still warm. They chose cold light and thin shadows. Left horses where the trail remembered too much. Knocked once. Paper outranked performance. Inside, the smell arrived first. Confinement. Illness. Fear. Two interior doors faced the room, each with iron hasps bolted through plank from the outside. Keys came from beneath Silas's collar on a cord worn smooth. Behind the first door, Delilah sat emptied of time. Behind the second, Prudence rocked and smiled at men as if they had come kindly. Temperance stood and pointed to the earth behind the cabin. "He buried them there," she said. The ground confirmed it. In that moment, the truth finished folding the family tree into itself. Father, husband, God's voice, all the same mouth. Ward ran ahead of the deputies the way fire runs a ridgeline, fast and hungry. By the time Silas Farnham was brought down from the gap, the town had already begun to arrange its face for what it would have to admit it had not seen. People gathered without being called. Men stood with their hats in their hands, not out of respect, but because shame needs somewhere to go. Women pressed handkerchiefs to mouths that had practiced silence for years. The sisters were taken out wrapped in blankets, blinking at daylight, as if it were a language they once knew and had forgotten. Delilah had to be carried. Her body weighed less than it should have, as if something essential had been taken and never returned. Prudence smiled at strangers and hummed fragments of hymns. Pleased by kindness, she did not yet understand, was kindness. Temperance did not look back at the hollow. She watched the road instead, counting turns, anchoring herself to motion. Behind the cabin, the deputies worked with a care that belonged to burial, not excavation. Two small truths came up from the soil, wrapped in dirt and stones, arranged by hands that had learned to call it mercy. No names, no dates, just proof that blood had been spilled and answered only by prayer. A marker was placed. Hats came off again. No one spoke. That night, the town decided what to do with the place itself. No meeting, no vote. Some decisions rise fully formed. Men rode up with lanterns and kerosene. Timber that had held secrets so carefully caught fast. Flames climbed walls and found the roof, eating scripture and iron alike. The fire burned hot enough to erase the smell that had lived there too long. When the last beam fell, the hollow took on a new name spoken low and never written down. Devil's Hollow. Some places cannot be left standing without continuing the harm. The church rang its bell once the next morning. Not for mourning, not for judgment, for order. Ministers spoke of trials and tests and the danger of false prophets. Records were checked and corrected. Baptismal lists amended. Family Bibles examined for omissions that now screamed. A community learned how much labor it takes to undo believing the wrong man. In jail, Silas preached to stone walls. He spoke of persecution and righteousness, of a covenant the world was too weak to carry. He offered no apology. He did not need one. In his mind, the work had been done correctly. Outside, Sheriff Pritchard set evidence in rows and translated horror into language the court would be forced to hear. The family tree, once folded, could not be unfolded. Father and husband occupied the same line. Daughters were wives by command. Children were grandchildren and sons all at once, their existence denied to preserve a lie that had already rotted through. The town felt the weight of it settle. This was not an outsider's crime. It had grown here, fed by distance and deference. Years later, people would say the fire purified the land. Others would say nothing purifies a place like that. They would be right. Ash only hides what roots remain. The trial did not end the story. It sealed it into paper and sent it forward in time, where it waited. Nearly 80 years later, in the late 1980s, a woman sat alone in a county records room with a stack of brittle files and a headache that would not leave. Her name did not matter to Stone County. She was a genealogist by training, a historian by habit, hired to trace land transfers ahead of a federal survey. Old deeds, old names, old boundaries. Paperwork meant to be bloodless. That was the lie of it. She found the gap, because the gap resisted classification. The land changed hands on paper, without ever quite leaving the same shadow. A cabin burned, yet the acreage carried annotations in 3 different inks. One clerk had written, contested. Another had written nothing at all. A third had drawn a line straight through the entry, as if the land itself offended him. She followed the marginal notes backward. Farnham, Farnham again. Then a long silence where daughters should have been listed and were not. No marriages. No deaths. No births that made sense. She requested court transcripts and was handed a box with a warning tone disguised as politeness. Some things, she was told, were better left to their century. Inside were photographs she hadn't expected. Black and white plates mounted on crumbling card. A cabin half, collapsed, its interior doors removed and stacked like lumber. Iron hardware laid out on a table the way surgeons display tools. A patch of disturbed earth behind the structure, marked with stakes. She studied faces in the margins, deputies, townspeople, and noticed how many were looking away from the camera. The transcripts were worse. Testimony stripped of its blood and still unbearable. A preacher insisting on divine authority. A sheriff choosing each word as if it might explode. A young woman named Temperance. Her statements recorded in a clerk's steady hand that could not show how her voice must have sounded. Incest. Imprisonment. Murder. Words that sat on the page like stones. The genealogist traced the line forward instead of back. One name reappeared in Kansas records under a different spelling. Marriage. Children. Ordinary life laid carefully over a fault line. She found a death notice from the 1950s, small and unremarkable, and felt the room tilt. Survivors do not announce themselves. They pass. She requested hospital records next. Asylum admissions from the early 20th century. A Delilah Farnham appeared once, then vanished into notes about muteness and withdrawal. Prudence followed later, listed as childlike, well into adulthood. The language tried to soften what could not be softened. When she closed the last folder, the room felt colder. Not haunted. Informed. Some histories do not want witnesses. They tolerate them. She wrote her report narrowly, professionally. No speculation, no narrative. Just facts stitched together with dates. It satisfied the contract and changed nothing publicly. But privately, she kept copies. Photographs, transcripts. Because some knowledge, once uncovered, refuses to go back into the ground. And somewhere in Stone County, the land in Devil's Hollow remained unbuilt on, avoided not by law, but by instinct. Children learn not to play there without being told why. Adults drove faster past the turn. Silence adapted, it always does. By the time the documents surfaced in the late 20th century, Stone County had already decided how it would remember. Or rather, how it would not. The fire at the gap had done its work too well. No foundation remained to argue with. No standing walls to point at and say there. The land sloped back into trees and brush, patient, unremarkable. New growth covered old wounds the way skin always tries to. Only the name lingered, past mouth to ear. Never written on a sign. Devil's Hollow, a warning disguised as a nickname. The town's reaction, back then, had not been uniform. Some men had ridden out to burn the cabin with anger in their chests, convinced destruction could stand in for atonement. Others stayed home, shutters closed, choosing not to watch because watching would have made them participants. The church held extra services and spoke carefully about false prophets, about wolves in shepherd's clothing, about the danger of confusing authority with holiness. What they did not say was how easily it had happened, how familiar the man had been, how much comfort there is in believing evil arrives loudly, instead of praying softly on your neighbor's porch. Animals were destroyed, too. Livestock taken from the property and put down without ceremony. Some said it was precaution. Others said it was superstition. Bloodline fear lingers longer than smoke. Family records were altered. Bibles had pages removed. Names were struck through as if ink could cauterize memory. A collective hand reached back and tried to smooth the past flat. It never quite works. Children who grew up decades later learned the story sideways. Not the details. Never the details. They learned which hollow to avoid. Which adults went quiet when a preacher raised his voice too much. Which questions earned a look that said not here. Trauma doesn't need to be explained to be inherited. It travels just fine without language. The genealogist never published her findings beyond the required report, but copies moved anyway. A photograph here, a transcript there, passed between historians, archivists, people who believed the past mattered, even when it embarrassed the present. Each reader felt the same tightening in the chest when the family tree collapsed inward, when father and husband occupied the same space, when children existed only long enough to be denied. The sisters' lives, what could be traced of them, refused neat conclusions. Delilah disappeared into care and silence, her name appearing only once more in a ledger that recorded her death without comment. Prudence lived gently, managed rather than healed, her smile preserved like a pressed flower until illness ended what understanding never had. Temperance alone remade herself. New name, new state, a marriage built on choosing rather than obedience. 2 children raised without the language that had once trapped her. Survival expressed not as triumph, but as continuation. Stone County carried on. Counties always do. Roads were graded. New preachers arrived. The hollow stayed hollow. And beneath all of it ran a thin, cold current of knowledge that isolation is not neutral, that faith without witnesses curdles, and that silence, once practiced long enough, begins to feel like virtue. There are places where history does not sleep. It only waits for the ground to shift. In the early 2000s, a survey crew cut a temporary line through Devil's Hollow, their task ordinary and their equipment precise. GPS units chirped, stakes went in. A man with a clipboard noted soil composition and drainage, irritated by how often the signal dropped beneath the trees. They worked quickly, without ceremony, because no one lingers there longer than necessary, not even those who claim not to believe. The first anomaly appeared as a depression that refused to map cleanly. The earth settled differently, compacted in a way that suggested handling. Digging was not part of the job, but curiosity is difficult to regulate. A shovel went in, then another. They stopped when metal rang against stone in a way that was not stone. The county was notified. Procedures followed. Archaeologists arrived, careful, neutral, trained to touch the past, without waking it more than necessary. What they found matched the records the genealogist had kept to herself. 2 burial sites, no markers, no formal boxes, remains too small to be confused for anything else. The past, when ignored, has a habit of insisting. The discovery reopened files no one wanted reopened. Names surfaced again in meeting minutes and quiet phone calls. The sheriff at the time read the old transcripts with the same tight mouth his predecessor's photograph had shown decades earlier. Nothing legally new could be done. The perpetrator was long dead, the victims too. But acknowledgement has a gravity all its own. A decision was made to leave the remains in place. Disturbance would add nothing. A stone was set, uninscribed, visible only to those who knew where to look. No ceremony was announced. Still, people came. They stood without speaking, hands in pockets, unsure what posture was appropriate for grief inherited rather than experienced. Local papers ran a brief notice. Historical remains identified in county survey. No names, no context. Just enough truth to prevent rumor, not enough to teach. That balance has always been the town's specialty. In private, conversations changed. Parents warned children differently, not with fear, but with clarity, about authority, about secrecy, about the difference between faith and control. The story became less about a monster and more about conditions that let one grow undisturbed. Devil's Hollow remained unbuilt, not protected, not sanctified, simply avoided. As if the land itself had become a margin note, reminding anyone who passed that some structures, once erected, do not deserve replacement. History, when finally heard, does not shout. It lowers its voice and waits to see who will lean in. The Hollow never asked for forgiveness. It did not need it. Years passed, then more years. The way they do when a place has decided to remain unchanged. Trees thickened where the cabin once stood. Leaves fell and returned. Snow came and went without ceremony. If you did not know what had happened there, nothing in the land would tell you outright. That is how most truths survive, by blending in. Stone County learned to carry the story without speaking it. Not as legend, not as warning signs nailed to posts, but as instinct. People watched preachers a little longer before trusting them. Doors were knocked on twice. Isolation stopped being romantic. When someone said, "Keep it in the family," the phrase no longer sounded harmless. The records remained, in archives, in copies passed quietly between historians, in files labeled carefully enough to avoid attention, but clearly enough to prevent disappearance. Proof has its own patience. It does not demand belief. It only asks not to be buried again. Temperance's descendants would never know the full shape of what she escaped. She had chosen that mercy deliberately. But choices ripple even when reasons are withheld. Her children learned early that love required consent. That obedience without question was not virtue. That silence, when imposed, is violence in a patient disguise. As for Silas Farnham, his name dissolved the way such names should. No markers, no legacies. Just a caution embedded in legal precedent and local memory. The covenant, he claimed, was never recognized by the world he tried to exclude. Time proved stronger than doctrine. Devil's Hollow remains a blank space on the map. No fence, no sign. Just an absence where something once stood that should never stand again. Travelers pass without stopping. Birds do not linger. The land has learned what it was asked to hold and has chosen, finally, to let it go. And that is how the story ends. Not with justice that balances the scales, because some scales cannot be balanced, but with knowledge preserved, harm named, and silence broken just enough to keep it from happening again. Some histories are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be remembered.